This is the Vision 79 podcast, where my friend Sander and myself, Mason, discuss recent developments in our business and personal growth. The name Vision 79 comes from our respective racing numbers. Sander's is 40, mine is 39, and together we have a shared vision for success in business and personal life. Many successful people have started small, just like us, but very few of them have documented their early years, though they often say they wish they had. And given we believe in learning lessons from others, we intend to be the first to document our journey from start to finish. Today, we'll discuss why imposter syndrome grips so many modern-day college graduates, what conditions are required to produce imposter syndrome, how to avoid those conditions, whether or not Sander and I have ever experienced it ourselves, and much more. But first, we like to start every podcast with a brief update about where we're at in our business and personal lives so that when we go back and look on these videos in the future, we can gauge roughly where we're at in life. So what do you have for business this week?
Business this week, looked over some of the documents that you had created, gave a little bit of feedback and input. We chatted with, I guess I'll have to edit that out. We chatted with investor very briefly, but have not heard back from him on confirmation of a date.
Although I did get
message him.
I did get confirmation that today is the final day of the other project that he's doing, and he will be ready to meet in the early half of this week.
Yeah, I think last week when I chatted with him, he said like Thursday-ish. So
Thursday of this week?
Of last week. So I'm glad that like now it's like actually wrapping up.
Yep. And then I talked to the guy that he's doing the project with. He was like, Sunday is the day. So they're finished today.
Got it. Okay, yeah. Got it. Worked on some personal business stuff, looking back a little bit into drop shipping, and I got my trading stuff almost set up at this point. I would argue I'm about 65% of the way there.
Cool.
There was a bunch of like little notes I wrote down about all the little steps I did, but all in all, it's just basic broker setup and reviewing material. And looking back at acclimating myself to what I want my approach to be in terms of the product lineup for the drop shipping, as well as looking into just listening to a bunch of different podcasts about business. Everett texted us the Hermosi podcast, which was great. Everett's a friend of ours.
Yep.
And that's pretty much in summary. I had a bunch of small notes written down, but that's the big overall picture.
Yeah, I think one of the big ones is actually helping Everett get his product into more businesses.
Yeah, true.
Everett has been talking to us about business for probably over a year now. He took a huge interest with our baked goods business when we were running that. And of all the advice that we gave him, I think it's safe to say that he took a lot of it, and he's doing really well with his business. And we were very honored to set up a meeting with someone that we know who can get his product into his businesses. And Everett made that meeting stick, and they're having a launch party this Friday to get his product into those businesses. So I'm super stoked for him, super proud of him. I think it'd be fun to have him on the podcast, kind of to give him a landmark of, hey, remember the times where life was kind of tricky and life kind of sucked. Because honestly, he might be only a couple months away from life not being that way.
Right. Very true.
So I'd love to get him in here. I worked on a lot of documentation. I worked on the construction sequence. So when you have to do the build out, what should come first, second, third, and roughly how long those things are going to take. I worked on more training documentation and product training, and I have ready for review the events list. So regular events, what does that entail? What resources do you need for them, and when should they happen? Who needs to be involved? What do you have for life?
For life, I have the only update I think I wrote down is about the race I went to yesterday at Daytona.
Tell us about that.
Super fun. It was called the HSR Daytona 24. It's essentially a bunch of stuff from the 60s up until the modern era. There are 7 different groups and multiple classes in each group, and they all kind of race together and battle it out in 45-minute race segments over the course of 24 hours that are broken apart by 15-minute breaks. Some of the highlight cars that I saw, I wrote down. I specifically didn't tell you about these, so I could share them with you on the fly on the podcast. BMW 3.0 CSL, a Jägermeister liveried Porsche 935, as well as a white 935 in the Martini livery, I believe.
That's fucking cool.
Yeah. Lots of 911s from a variety of years, from the 1960s up until, 2010s. 3 Porsche 914-6s, Trans Am and Can Am race cars, a variety of them. I think I saw about half a dozen there.
That's cool.
Some of them on track, some of them I did not see on track, but it is what it is. I saw 2 Lolas, if you know what those are. They raced in the American Le Mans series. 1 Shelby Cobra, as well as a early 70s Corvette race car with a big 427 in it.
And Gerald Miklo?
Yeah, Gerald Miklo was there. As well as I made a connection with a few people, and one of them happened to have a 914 similar to mine. And
Romantic connections.
Very much so. And he talked about a brake guy that he knows by the name of Eric Shia. He works for PMB Performance, Porsche, Mercedes-Benz, and BMW.
Cool.
PMB. And we also chatted about something interesting about the 917K brake calipers. So when they were building those cars, they hand painted with a brush the calipers. And so from factory, they had these runs in them and all these imperfections in the paint. And the paint was actually laid on super thick too to help with the heat.
Oh, interesting.
Which is part of the reason why those calipers from factory look so ugly. And this guy, Eric Shia, who Tommy, the gentleman I talked with, referred me to, actually, he restores brake calipers, specifically like his specialty is brakes. And he has the exact paint that they used. And he does that same super thick layering on it. And so they look just like the factory ones, even though they're not perfect. It's like an exact replica of what it was.
That's super cool.
I just thought it was a cool little tidbit that I learned. I did not know that about those calipers, and I thought it was interesting. But overall, other than that, for life, I had a little bit more work at work to do this week. We had
Work at work.
We had a sim, which is essentially when we do a simulation of a launch in the Launch Control Center. So I went through that process. I sat as secondary on the hydraulic systems component.
Cool.
So it was very long, listen to a lot of different problems and kind of wait for stuff to come your way. But other than that, we have a couple other jobs involving dog tags and some hydrazine cart stuff and whatever. So just kind of been helping out here and there as I can help people. I'm still younger, so I'm not able to help everyone, but I can do what I can. So that was pretty much my life update.
In stark contrast to simulation, the B-2 bomber dropped a 30 kiloton bunker buster bomb on the Taliban weapons storage sites last week. I got to hear about that a couple days early at work, which was pretty sick.
I think you sent me a video of the ground penetrating. Yeah,
dude, it goes that
isn't it like 150 feet?
It goes up. It goes 100. I think that one did 110 feet underground and then detonated it to blow up the missile stores, or their ammunition stores. But that was just
imagine taking like 4 years to build this bunker 110 feet under the ground, and then the United States military just comes along with one bomb and destroys the whole entire project.
Crazier than that is that jet and that bomb are outdated, and that's why the B-21 exists, because they're like, that's not good enough anymore. It is clearly still competitive. But on the topic of cars, I sent you a video of the Stance Works F40.
Yes.
And you sent me a text back, and I didn't read it on purpose because I didn't want to know what your opinions were on it. Because as soon as Stance Works is a guy who took a Ferrari 388 and made it into a race car. So he totally
328.
328. Yes. He ripped it apart. He repainted it. He changed it.
It was a 308. I'm sorry, I've misspoken. It's a 308 GTBI.
There you go. Yeah. Ripped it apart, made it into a race car, and went and raced it. And it's a really nice looking build. So he does a bunch of cars like that.
That car was K24 swapped with a turbo.
Yep.
And made about 1,000 horsepower.
Yeah. And so his next project, he got a hold of all original from factory Ferrari F40 body panels, and he's going to build his own space frame inside, space tube frame.
Yep.
With his own powertrain and everything. And I was like, man, dude, I've got to send this to Sander, because it's like built not bought DIY shit, but also it's an F40, which is like the last of the Ferrari approved, approved car. And I want to know what your thoughts are on it.
I think it's great. I love it.
Why?
So I love the fact that he's essentially taking the F40, this super iconic car, and making it his own and modernizing it, but very tastefully. And you can see that it's tasteful because of the care he took into actually getting like real componentry and how he's going through this thought process. And he talks about going through different engineering steps to, make this chassis and to build the suspension around it and blah, blah, blah. And so you can see he really cares about the Ferrari pedigree and he really cares about this car. And this is like a dream for him. And I like to see that come alive.
Yeah.
Additionally, the rear valence piece under the rear clamshell is off of the Ferrari F40 LM Tipo, which was in that video too, which is kind of a cool little tribute. I really have loved to have seen the LM front and rear clamshells on the one he's building, which he had the option to buy, but they're obviously crazy expensive.
Well, he's planning to swap the front out with an LM when he can get it because he doesn't like the headlights.
Yes. Yeah. Actually, it's funny though, because my favorite part of the LM, I do love the headlights, but I think one of my favorite parts of the LM body style is the rear with the little break in the center. I really love the way that looks. But he does have LM doors on the car, which is pretty interesting. And he already has a powertrain picked out, which he did not disclose on YouTube, but I subscribed to his Patreon so that I could find out what it was because I was super curious. He's going to be using the V10 that came in the 812 Superfast.
Okay, that's appropriate.
It's essentially a I don't know if I should even say that. I guess maybe it'll be a couple.
Yeah, both our listeners thrilled. You and I on Monday.
Anyways, rumor has it. But it's essentially a 800 horsepower V10 with a 6-speed sequential gearbox that he's going to put on it. I think it's a very cool motor. I was glad to see that he's not doing a Honda motor like he did for the 308. I'm glad to see that he's not doing an LS because I feel like that would just kind of put a damper on the uniqueness of this project. And I'm glad that he's not doing a 2JZ inline 6 style motor because I feel like that doesn't do the pedigree of the Ferrari justice. So I think he made an awesome decision. I mean, who am I to say it's not my car anyway, but I think it will be really cool to see that powertrain in that car. I will be sad to see the front clamshell cut up to look like an LM clamshell. I think that'll be a little bit sad, especially since it's new old stock from 1991. It's gonna be kind of see that cut up, but at the same time, I was like, I'd rather see that one screwed with than a real LM clamshell screwed with,
right?
So because it's like at least there are more of those regular ones out there, and it's also his car; he can do whatever he wants. But overall, I think it's very tasteful. I love the idea of building a tube chassis car around, underneath the F40. He also raised an awesome point: is that many people think that the F40 was a carbon fiber monocoque, whereas in reality it's set on a steel frame.
The McLaren F1 was the first production car with a carbon fiber monocoque.
Yes. And so I thought that was, a lot of people, I think, come at that car with like, it's got all this crazy awesome technology. And like, yes, it does have some like great innovative stuff on it. And it is a cool car. But at the end of the day, it's very bare bones. He talks about how like the new panels he bought, new old stock, a lot of them have like big imperfections in terms of like the manufacturing quality. And it was super funny because he said that the newer Ferraris obviously don't have these manufacturing defects and whatever, but I worked on a 612 Scaglietti and I saw very similar manufacturing defects and problems in those cars too. I think it's just kind of like an Italian thing. It's like make the motor run good and make it pretty fast, exaggerate the numbers a little bit, and then don't worry about the quality of the assembly.
There's a famous Enzo quote, which is, I don't care if the door gaps are straight. I want the driver to shit his pants when he steps on the gas pedal. Which lives up to that. I'm happy to see that it's a V10. I think that suits it. But also the F40
and naturally aspirated is going to do ITBs.
That's sick.
When
he was talking about the carbon fiber monocoque, part of me was like, man, that sucks because I think that a carbon fiber tub would feel faster, but at the same time, a carbon fiber tub F40 doesn't feel right, because the F40 wasn't like there weren't many huge categories where it wasn't
like 10 years or 20 years ahead of his time. It was just really good for the time it was built in.
Yeah, I think what I love about the F1 is different about what I love about the F40, because the F1 was like, everything is brand fucking new, space age, cutting edge technology, and everything in the F40 is like, here's everything that we've come up with already, but perfected. So like the F40 feels like the end of an era, and the McLaren F1 feels like an era of its own or a new one. And I can love the two cars independently for those two reasons. Although I will say his cutting up the front end hurt when I heard it, but then I remembered these panels are new old stock. So they weren't apart from the underside that was actually raced. As a diffuser.
Yeah.
The rest of them, new old stock, were never put on a car. It was just like they've been in boxes their entire life. So it's not like they come from VIN numbered cars, and like you're not ruining other historical pieces because of that. And the argument of like, it's his car, he can do what he wants with it, is true. Though when you see Whistling Diesel take like a car that's like, oh, that's attached to a VIN number and that's an entire vehicle, and he just lit it on fire. That sucks to see, because it's like, dude, like that car had a soul type of feeling. But with these F40 pieces, they weren't ever tied to the rest of the vehicle. Like they were sitting around as spares anyway. So he's giving the spares like a soul of their own,
I think it's also really clever because with the 308 project, he took a car with an existing VIN number and then modified it all up to kind of be what he wanted it to be and called it the 244. K or something like that. 244, whatever.
Well, I think it was the 244K because he was using the K motor.
Oh, yeah, right. Yeah. That would make sense. And 244 because 2.4 liter 4-cylinder. Right. I think we talked about that a couple weeks ago with the 308, 328. Remember that?
Yeah, the Ferrari numbers.
Yeah. So that was a kind of nice little tidbit there too.
I wonder if he knows that.
I'm sure he does. He has to.
I wonder how many people actually know the Ferrari naming strategy. It took me 2.5 decades. And
308 means 3.0 liter 8-cylinder. 328 means 3.2 liter 8-cylinder. 348, you get the picture. And he made the 244. It's 2.4 liter 4-cylinder.
Yeah.
So, but the clever thing about this F40 project too is that there's no VIN number tied to it. So it's like if Ferrari were to issue a cease and desist letter, it's like, what car are they issuing it for?
Exactly.
Right?
Yeah.
It's like they could easily issue a cease and desist for the 244 because it has a VIN number. But when he goes to register that vehicle, like there is no like definitive VIN number for the car. Every single panel has come either from a different car or is new old stock. Like there is no like tied car that this goes to. So it's like, what are you stopping them from doing? You know what I mean?
It's tricky because are you familiar with B is for Build? He built that crazy Lamborghini Huracan with the LS in the back and the exposed turbos.
Oh, yeah.
He did an Eleanor build. Eleanor is the Mustang from...
Oh, not Bullet.
It's like Speed... Oh, it might have been Bullet.
Was it Bullet?
I think it was Bullet.
Oh, okay.
Eleanor was the name of the Mustang. It was a modified Mustang. It had a unique look. So he did his own Eleanor build, and he was given a cease and desist, and then I think sued for using that IP. So he couldn't post like the entire second half of the project. He went through with it anyways, but couldn't release anything, so didn't make any money on it, and it really sucked. Ferrari could sue him for the F40 like IP, I guess, but I don't know, especially if he doesn't call it an F40.
I mean, also Liberty Walk did a F40.
They did. Yeah.
I think that got a cease and desist letter, but I don't know if anything ever really happened with that.
Yeah, I'm not sure.
So I think that Ferrari's gotten a little bit more lax. I think if like you respect the heritage enough, they kind of like give you a quick pass versus like if you're Whistling Diesel and you're just going to set it on fire, they probably won't give you a pass.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? So I think it's really customer dependent, and that's kind of how Ferrari's always run. Like even with like the allocations of the LaFerraris and the Enzos and all those fancy cars, like those cars, Ferrari would call you and give you the privilege of paying for one. Right. And so I think that Ferrari's kind of always operated that way. And so I anticipate that looking at the amount of care that he's taking into this build, I think that it will go well. And I don't think that Ferrari will come after him personally. I don't see them as coming after him. And I think it'll be a really awesome car once it's done, especially with that powertrain in it.
They were cool with the 308 build. But that's also a 308 and not an F40. And like everybody loves the F40. Right.
Well, the thing is, though, is that this isn't like really a whole F40 either. It's just kind of a compilation of parts from around the country.
Yeah, I'm not sure.
You know,
I see it going many ways. Also, Liberty Walk is like, even though Liberty Walk is aftermarket, it's still got prestige like in itself.
Yeah.
So it's kind of like
Stanceworks doesn't quite have the name of Liberty Walk.
Not yet, but I mean, honestly,
I mean, after this build, they might.
Honestly, his last build is beautiful.
Yeah. So, I never even heard of that 308 until he showed it in that footage. I'd never known he'd built that.
It's cool.
And then I looked into it a little bit. It's an awesome car. Super cool.
One of my buddies put a K motor in his Miata. He K swapped it, and that made like, I think it was in the 450s, which for a Miata is fucking insanity. It was a drift car.
The K series stuff, just like power per displacement.
Yeah,
it's so hard to beat. Like it's just wild what they can push out of those motors.
Yeah. Although I am excited to see a naturally aspirated V10. I don't feel like there are enough of those. Yeah. Actually, this weekend, Formula One was at Brazil,
Oh, yes.
And Lewis Hamilton got the chance to drive Ayrton Senna's 1990 MP 5B.
Well, it's MP4-5, I believe.
I think it's an MP5-B. The fours were 1989.
Tell us in the comments.
Anyways, he got to drive it in the rain, which is sick. It was qualifying was rained out on Saturday and pushed to Sunday morning, so people weren't sure. He was supposed to drive it after qualifying Saturday.
Got it.
So when that got rained out, no one was sure.
Did you see the footage of the rain across the grandstands? I saw some.
Oh yeah, dude. Yeah.
It was crazy.
Flooded, fully flooded. Yeah. And they had to push all of qualifying to today, but even today it was raining on and off like throughout both sessions. It was pretty crazy. But that's why.
Did they do the race today too? Yes. Qualifying and race? Oh, yes. Wow.
That's why I'm drinking a Red Bull today.
Oh, got it.
Because to set the precedent for this race, Max Verstappen has not won a race since May. Last race he won was Spain.
Really?
It was 10 rounds ago. Yeah.
Whoa.
So last year he went from winning 10 in a row to not winning in 10.
Wow.
So everyone's talking about whether or not Lando Norris with McLaren has a chance to win the Drivers' Championship.
Right.
Because if he outscores Max by 10 points a race, which is like Lando winning and Max getting like P3, or Lando getting P2 and Max getting like P5, then Lando can win the championship. And so it's sprint weekend this weekend, meaning you do sprint qualifying, sprint, and then qualifying in the race. So there's opportunities to score more points. And in the sprint qualifying, Lando's like P1 or P2, and Max is like P4. Piastri gets a better start than Lando, passes him on the first lap, and then hands the lead back to Lando for the end of the sprint. Lando gets 8 points. Max is in fourth, and then gets a 5-second penalty for something I can't remember. So he ends up being like fifth. So net, Lando's like ahead 5 points. So he only needs to score 5 points more than Max in the race. Max had to take a new engine. So he has a 5-place grid penalty starting the race. And on his last lap in Q1, Lance Stroll crashed in front of him and ruined his lap, and he got knocked out in Actually, I think it was Q2 he was knocked out in. His starting position on the grid for the race was 17th, and Lando started on pole. Whoa. Hamilton started, I think, 18th or 15th. It was right ahead of Max. This is the first time ever that Lewis Hamilton and Max Verstappen have started a race together where not either of them have made Q3.
Whoa.
So started at the top 10, which is crazy. So Lando's in the lead. Yeah. It's raining, so the lead is the best because you don't get the spray from the person ahead of you.
Right.
And if Lando wins this race and Max doesn't score points because he's in fucking 17th, then he takes a huge jump in the drivers, and it's actually going to be a title fight. And by the end of lap 1, Max Verstappen, who started in 17th, so in the first corner, Lando loses the lead to George Russell, which he's known for, notoriously losing the lead on lap 1. So Lando's in P2, and by the end of the first lap, Max Verstappen passes Lewis Hamilton for 9th in one lap, and then proceeds to fucking cut his way through the field. He pits to get ahead of Norris at a really great timed safety car, red flag for the rain. And he wins the race by 19 seconds, and Lando Norris was P6 with a pending penalty. Ooh. So Max, who hasn't won in this half of the season and hasn't finished within 19 seconds of the leader this second half of the season, just won by 19 seconds in the rain. Lewis Hamilton and Fernando Alonso, who are both like crazy wet weather drivers, both finished out of the points. Wow. Max was P1 by 19 seconds, which is why I'm drinking a Red Bull.
That's awesome. So does he have the championship clinched?
He can win it at the next race if he outscores Lando by X amount of points. But if it's not next race, it'll probably be the one after that, the penultimate race of the season.
Got it. Got it. Yeah. The cool thing about rain is that it really washes out the engineering differences between the cars, and it really just dives down the driver. Yeah. You know, that's what I always kind of liked about racing in the rain was I honestly wasn't even that great in the rain. But what I liked is that it also mitigated all of the people who just had faster karts. Yeah. And so it made me more competitive with them, and it gave me a lot of room to improve and, make those passes or get up in the field if I needed to. Yeah. So I always really enjoyed the rain, even though I wasn't the fastest in the rain, lack of experience in it. But
it was great to see fun at this stage of the season, because there's been a lot of talk. Max has been getting a lot of penalties. Like in Mexico last weekend, Lando was trying to get past him, and Max knows if he's ahead by the apex, then he can run Lando off the track, and technically it's his position, and that's okay. So Max always like like as Lando's coming to pass him, just fucking dive bombs it, totally runs it out because he's ahead at the apex. And the apex is subjective. Yeah. It's dependent on where you want to turn, right?
Right.
And he did that twice, and the stewards in Mexico gave him 2 10-second penalties for him to serve at his next pit stop. But it was the second or third lap of the race, so Max just kept Lando behind him for like half the race, then served his penalty. So he held Lando up for half the race, and Lando wound up getting P2 like 5 seconds off of first place. So Max effectively stopped him from winning. So everyone's talking about how, oh, Max is a dirty driver. If Max doesn't have the fastest car, then he's actually no good. He has to cheat to make his way up there. Yeah. Other people are saying that Lando Norris isn't. Alain Prost actually was quoted as saying, Lando Norris is such a mentally and physically weak driver that you can give him the fastest car by 10 seconds a race, a teammate to give him the lead, and an entire team to back him up and slow the rest of the field down. He still won't win you a championship. Max Verstappen is going to win this championship with half a fucking race car. And so there's been like a lot of fucking disputes about like Lando or Max.
It's so funny how quickly people are to jump to conclusions. Like, oh, Max is now a bad driver. Or like, blah, blah, blah is now the next best thing. Like, people just love to grab onto the next newest thing. Instead of just like looking at what has been throughout history, and let us be unburdened by what has been throughout.
Well said, the day before the election. But it was really great to see, especially because even seasoned drivers like Hamilton and Alonso were struggling today. Like even if the most seasoned, the best in like changeable conditions are struggling, and Max is just like, dude, the last 10 laps, it was like fastest lap every lap. He just like was just cranking them out. And it was really awesome to see that like really like
Max is back,
like mental shift. Yeah.
Right.
It's just kind of nice when you see a level playing field and a dominant performance to kind of like just set everything straight.
Yeah.
But it was really cool to see.
Very cool.
My other life updates, a lot of progress with the Space Coast crew. We had another board meeting yesterday, and interestingly, the parents of the rowers are some pretty unique characters. One of them is a senator. One of them owns several McDonald's locations, and one of them is Howie of the Backstreet Boys.
Oh, really?
Yeah, he's a parent of one of the kids.
Wow.
Which I wouldn't expect any of those characters to be parents of rowers.
What an odd mix.
Team. Yeah, but it's really cool. And Grace is crushing real estate. She's actually looking at, she's gotten some leads from an open house for a $500,000 house. And if it sells, her commission would be like 10 grand. So for like one sale, you get like 10 grand.
Wow.
And the woman that she's working with is like, hey, this is your first sale. I'll help you with the paperwork if you give me a cut of your commission too. And she was like, okay, sounds good. Because that woman does over $1 million a year in sales. And that's not she sells over $1 million of houses. That's she earns on commission over $1 million a year.
Wow.
So she's moving weight, and she's going to teach Grace how to sell houses. But it's sick. I'm so proud of her. I'm really stoked. I can't wait for her to start making more money than me.
That's awesome. Congratulations, Grace.
Yeah.
If you're listening.
I'm stoked.
So
those are all my updates.
Cool. Yeah. I don't really have much else either. I'm just trying to crank through some stuff, and had a ton of fun at the race yesterday. It was a good time, and I'm a happy camper.
Awesome. Let's get into our main topic. So today we're talking about imposter syndrome. And I've noticed a trend amongst college graduates who do well in school, enter a position in the job field, and immediately feel like they're overpromising and underdelivering. They often feel underprepared for the job they're being paid to complete and are afraid to ask questions for fear of looking incompetent or stupid. So in this episode, I'd like to discuss why asking questions is a good thing and pretending to look like you know what you're doing doesn't really make you cool. It makes you stupid. And we can talk about imposter syndrome, why it's got a grip on people today, and then instances that we've experienced in the past and maybe why we don't experience it anymore.
Yeah.
But that's my intro before going into segment one, which is what is imposter syndrome. Do you have any generalities to talk about before we get into that?
I included most of my generalities into the main body.
Yep.
So I think you summarized our topics pretty well. Let's dive right in.
Cool. So the first segment is just defining what is imposter syndrome. And I have a definition here, which states that it's a psychological affliction in which individuals doubt their abilities, talents, or accomplishments and have a persistent fear of being exposed as a fraud despite evidence of their success. People with imposter syndrome often believe they don't deserve their achievements and worry they'll be found out, attributing to their success, luck, timing, or external factors irrelevant of their skills and hard work. And this is interesting because I immediately made a connection to our previous episode in which we spoke about confidence, cockiness, and capability. Or,
it was confidence and cockiness, but capability and competence was included in there.
Yeah. And imposter syndrome is a really great example of having competence, but no confidence or cockiness.
Right.
This is a continue. This is basically episode 35, part 2.
Yeah, it pretty much is, which is a really nice segue. I love your definition. Something that I would drop in there as well is that I think there's a portion of the lack of self-reflection. Like there's a part to imposter syndrome that stems from you not being able to self-reflect back and honestly review what you have done or what you're capable of doing in the future. And I think that point is key to distinguishing between doubt and imposter syndrome. Because doubt could also be, you have this task ahead of you and you don't feel like you can do it, but there also could be evidence that says you can do it, but you just doubt your ability, right? I think imposter syndrome kind of is a pervasive feeling that maintains through tasks, right? Firstly, whereas doubt is kind of circumstantial based on the thing. But then another important piece is that with doubt and imposter syndrome, there's a lack of self-reflection, but there's a critical wall that divides you between your ability to analyze yourself with imposter syndrome. It's like there's a wall you have to break down in order to get to that self-analysis and to figure out who you are. Whereas with doubt, it's a little bit more general, I think. Like you can kind of doubt yourself, but then come to the conclusion that maybe you can do it based off of evidence. But I think imposter syndrome is a much harder wall right there.
Yeah.
Right.
It's kind of like, I know that I'm not capable, and doubt is like, I'm not sure if I'll be able to do it.
Right.
I'll try anyways.
Yeah. That's a good analogy.
Yeah.
Who do you think this particularly affects? You mentioned college students, right? Or people getting into the workplace. Do you think that, do you think it's mostly high achievers? Do you think it's normal people? Normal people as in like people who just go to their 9-to-5s and don't really aspire to, build a business or have greater wealth or anything like that. Like, do you think it's mostly just the college kids or maybe like more common in another group of people? Where do you see it?
I think it's probably average people because high achievers want to do great things and will relentlessly pursue those great things. And if they don't know how to do something, they'll state that with themselves, and they'll say, I don't know how to do it, but I'm going to figure it out because I want my results to be good. They're results oriented. And if the results are good, then they're happy. Likewise, people who don't care and aren't high achievers, low achievers, they will openly say, I don't know how to do that, and then not try. But I think that average people are people who know that they need to produce results, but don't have the confidence in themselves that they'll actually be able to do it. So a lot of college graduates are not special people. They're kind of regular people, but then they've been handed this job title, which is something special. And now they feel a disconnection. I think it's the high achievers.
So my kind of take on this is I actually think it affects high achievers more. Because with high achievers, my argument internally when I was writing this stuff was that high achievers statistically have more evidence to back up their next task, right? So if they're going to form a new business, statistically they have formed another business or something similar beforehand, so they have evidence there to say that they can do it, but then they are saying they cannot do it because of their imposter syndrome, right? Versus a general 9-to-5 person who might try to build a business for the first time. I don't think it's quite imposter syndrome in terms of their lack of reflection because they might have no evidence to show that they can build this business, right? I think that, at least from personally what I've seen, I think a lot of the more normies, maybe not a lot of, but I see like normies people in terms of like, just I guess general 9-to-5 people. I don't know if that's politically correct or not. I'm going to refer them to as normies.
Normies is fine.
Yeah. So normies, I think that there can be imposter syndrome there. But I think you also pose a good argument. Maybe I'm putting words in your mouth a little bit, but with, I think one of the things I heard you say is that with high achievers, they, in their process of building a business or of self-improvement or self-growth, they in place the systems into their mind to be able to analyze and to be able to grow, right? So I see the argument of like maybe it's less common in high achievers because they're already kind of apt to look at themselves and analyze what they can and can't do, versus like with like normies, it's very challenging for them to understand what they can or cannot do if they don't have a history of figuring out what they can or cannot do. Right. If all they've done is just go to their 9 to 5 and sit in the, a cush life and watch Netflix, then they're not really going to have a good gauge of what they can do in the future, right?
Yeah.
So I see an argument for both there.
I think that high achievers, I mean, they're results based, right? So it's kind of, I feel like the high achievers might have this impending feeling of like, I'm not doing enough. And maybe they don't give enough credit to their past successes, but I think they still recognize that they have successes, right? So it's kind of like, okay, last semester's report card was all A's, but this semester's report card needs to be all A's. It's got to be. I got to do it, right? But I feel like a regular person, maybe their last report card like was mostly B's and C's. And so now looking ahead, they're like, dude, I don't know if I can get all A's, even though they're not recognizing the fact that they didn't really do much studying last semester. There's room for improvement. They don't know. They don't feel comfortable being there because they haven't actually ever tried hard enough to really do it.
I guess kind of the angle I'm trying to look at it from is that, especially with high achievers, there's a clear amount of evidence that they can do it, right? They got all A's last semester, so they can clearly do all A's next semester, right? But I think the part of imposter syndrome that I kind of try to dig into throughout my writings is that there's a lack of seeing that evidence.
Yeah, it's
right?
ignoring.
And I think that creates an important distinction between just like general doubt and imposter syndrome specifically. Because imposter syndrome, I think what kind of like a staple of it is you have to have evidence there to show that you can do this next task, but you are not seeing that evidence, right?
Yeah.
You can experience it and go through it, but if you're not seeing it, then you may experience imposter syndrome. Talk to your doctor if you experience imposter syndrome.
It's irrational doubt, right?
Right.
Yeah, it's there is something here to disprove doubt, and yet you have it anyways.
Yeah,
it's kind of like anxiety. It's like you have no real reason to be anxious right now. You just are.
Right. I hear that. I hear that. Most of my segment is about how do you get imposter syndrome and how do you avoid it. Do you want to dive into that
yeah, sure.
part? Or do you have more to say on the first segment?
No, that was good. I just had an example of a guy who I found on TikTok a long time ago, and he was a chem major in college. And he was taught the fundamentals of chemistry, but none of it really prepared him for his internship in a lab. And when he got there, he felt as though his coworkers and his manager expected him to know more than he really did. And he was kind of like learning on the job, but as a college graduate, he was really uncomfortable learning on the job because he felt like, well, I'm being paid for this position and I have this title. Like, I feel like I should already know how to do it.
Yeah.
But let's jump into the second segment, which is how do you get it and how do you avoid it? I've seen imposter syndrome in friends before, and I've seen a great deal of it online, like that guy from the TikTok. And I feel that it typically stems from labels. A great example of it is that chemistry guy. When you graduate with a degree in chemistry, people call you a chemist, even though you have little or no real experience in the field. It's kind of like calling someone a racing driver after a couple karting sessions. That's what I have for the intro.
Very interesting. Yeah. I wrote down here, my first point is that I think that imposter syndrome, as I've kind of stated, stems from a lack of confidence and honest self-reflection combined with a negative voice inside your head that is stronger than the positive one. And I think that I started to touch on the kind of mental wall that you have between the ability to analyze the evidence that you have gone through versus like how you actually feel and what you're experiencing, which would be the imposter syndrome, like that wall. I think that is the negative voice inside your head that's stronger than the positive one, right? And the combined factors between a lack of confidence, a lack of honest self-reflection, as well as a strong negative voice form a foundation for the absence of self-affirmation and recognition of achievements, right? And I think that's kind of fundamentally, at least a part of what happens with imposter syndrome is like you cannot access the part of your brain that can positively affirm you that you have gone through something similar before, or you've gone even through this exact same thing before, and you did it this time. There's a wall there to get there. And doubt is different from this because it's a temporary lack of belief in one's abilities that can be mitigated through evidential analysis. So that wall doesn't really quite exist with doubt. It might be a thin wall, like a thin barrier, but with reasoning, I think general doubt, people are able to access the evidence and make themselves feel better. It's more circumstantial. It's by like point on point, versus imposter syndrome, I think, is pervasive. And due to that lack of self-analysis, how do you think that self-analysis or self-reflection, do you think that there's kind of a negative voice that fuels imposter syndrome versus a positive one? Do you kind of see it that way, or do you see it differently?
Yeah, I think it's kind of like envy or jealousy, but in a mirror to yourself, where you would attribute someone else's successes to like luck or circumstance, and then you're doing that to yourself. You're essentially saying like, that guy isn't actually quick. He's not fast. He just has a better cart, and, he got lucky. It's not fair. And you're pointing that back at yourself, and you're saying, well, I don't really deserve to be here. I just got lucky. I have nepotism. I guessed correctly on the SATs, which got me into college, and then I guessed correctly on my tests, and now I have this job.
I have a question. Do you think that, so in, like, let's just take the example of Christianity, right? There's this idea that we, or Christians, submit themselves to Jesus Christ, and he takes the reins of their life and kind of guides them, right? They have free will, but they let Christ guide them in their life and, read the Bible in order to help, make choices about what they do, what they don't do, and stuff like that. Do you think that that idea, that principle to kind of give yourself to someone else, like God, fosters a mindset where you have a hard time actually figuring out what you need to do because of the evidence you have? Like, if you're always kind of putting your faith into something that's external to you and then kind of waiting for that to come back at you so that you can do your next thing, do you think that creates the wall where people have a hard time self-analyzing? Or maybe even, do you think that creates a pattern where people not only look to God to see what they should do next, but they also look to people around them and take their opinions and kind of use those opinions, right or wrong, to kind of fuel their forward thinking or what they're going to do next? Do you think that kind of, do you understand my question? It's kind of weird, but
yeah, I think it's more so kind of like a form of coping. It's like, I don't want to recognize the position that I'm at right now, good or bad, because I would rather attribute it to something else, success or failure, right? So it's either like, thank you, Jesus, for guiding me through this to my success, or God works in mysterious ways, and, it'll come back differently another time, right?
Right.
It's kind of like, I don't want to have to actually look at the evidence that brought me here for whatever reason. Right. I think it's a coping mechanism. Right.
Yeah.
And if imposter syndrome is similar to anxiety in that you can't recognize the work that you've actually done to get here, it's just a feeling that you have. Right. Then that's probably similar to whatever coping you have for anxiety. It's probably similar to a coping mechanism for that. Because if you can put the responsibility in someone else's hands, then it's not really your fault, which I think, makes losses a little bit easier, but also kind of takes away from your successes, because then you feel like you owe it to someone else.
Yeah. That the mindset, that connection is there. Like you approach those situations similarly, but one may be easy. It may be easy to use that mindset to alleviate yourself from responsibility of bad situations, but that same mindset, when applied to successes, also blocks you from seeing what your true capabilities are.
Yeah, and for me personally, I'm not religious, and one of the reasons is because I don't feel that. I feel that what happens to me is as a result of actions that I do, and if it's something like cancer, where it's just genetics, that's just the way that it is. I don't need to ask God why. I don't need an answer. There isn't an answer. It's just the way that it is. But for things that are within my control, I also don't need to ask God why, because I'm the one doing them. I have free will. And I feel like religion is really useful for setting general guidelines for how to use your free will most effectively, but it's not the most effective in actually getting you to reflect on what actions you've taken and if that's leading you to the right place or if you deserve to be where you are. Right.
Yeah. There was a really, I have a few things. There was a really interesting study recently actually about free will. And it not super recent, maybe a couple years ago at this point, but they went into, they looked at the brain through like an MRI scan, something like that. And they were able to see that in some patterns or in some way, they were able to figure out that the brain decides for them what their actions are going to. Ooh, this sounds really stupid what I'm saying. I'm just realizing that. But it's not that the brain decides what you're going to do before you actually do it. It's like before the information from the outside can be processed, the brain has already decided what it's going to do before you even like psychologically are able to process that stuff. So it's like the mind. So we think about free will coming from like our train of thought about what action we want to take next, right? So like we think about something and then we make a free will choice about what we want to do. But it's interesting because there's evidence to show that deeper than that, the brain actually already knows what is going to happen before we actually think about it and process it and make a decision. Like the brain has already come to a conclusion before we even go through that thought process of reasoning and evidence and analysis.
Well, it kind of sounds like instinct. It's like fight or flight.
Yeah, it's sort of. And I'm ill-informed on this. I read this study years ago, but it's just kind of interesting thing about free will. Another small tidbit I wanted to say is I don't know if you listened to the Joe Rogan podcast the Modern Wisdom podcast with Is Our Food Making Us Sick?
Might have. This was several months ago?
No, it wasn't too long ago. I don't think.
I might have started and then got disinterested. I can't remember.
It was
Who was
really
it with?
interesting.
Who was it with?
I can't remember.
Was it with that woman?
No, it was a guy. Although I think I know the woman you're talking about. I think she was on Joe Rogan.
The woman
quite a while back.
Really bored me.
This guy was really interesting. He talked about all the chemicals in the water,
Turning the frogs gay.
Yeah. He talked about stuff like that and like chemicals that are illegal in other countries versus the US because of how we structure the FDA and all these approval things, whatever.
Yeah.
It was just really interesting because a lot of those chemicals are linked to, like the psychological problems that a lot of adolescents and young adults have today, or like the health condition problems that we have and stuff like that. So it was just an interesting little tidbit. If you guys are interested, check out Modern Wisdom. But I thought of it because of you mentioned the cancer thing. Like if it happens, it happens.
Oh yeah.
So it was just interesting.
But that's the thing. It's like, it's not God punishing me for not believing it.
Right. It's chemicals in the water.
Fucking chemicals in the water. It's the government trying to make the frogs gay or the Russians gay. And that trickle-down effect comes to me and gives me fucking brain tumors, right?
Right.
But I don't know. I think that also, if there really is a God and you die and get to the gates and he's trying to decide whether to let you in or not, it doesn't really matter whether or not you believed in him because there's not sufficient evidence to actually prove to me that he's there. But so long as he judges me as a good person, then he'll let me in anyways. It's kind of like, I really doubt that I would get there and he would be like, hey man, listen, you were kind to everybody you met. You gave to charity. You did your best not to hurt anybody. But you didn't bet on me, bro. Get back down there and like send me down to hell. I feel like that would be a pretty fucking, that would be a dick thing to do.
It's interesting. This podcast is definitely not a Bible lecture and neither of us are qualified to give one. But there is an interesting part of, I think this is, maybe Leviticus, I'm not sure, but they talk about how it is harder for a rich man or a wealthy man to get into heaven than it is to like put a camel through a needle or something like crazy like that.
Really difficult for a rich
it's
man
like
to get
really the point they're trying to make is that it's really, really hard for a wealthy person to get into heaven because they have access to all of these things that are considered sins. And even if they like do donate to charity and do all this other stuff, I think that at least the perception of the Bible and of, the Christian faith is that what is in your heart and what you feel inside matters a lot more or can matter more than what you actually convey on the outside. So it's kind of interesting.
This was Leviticus.
I don't remember,
something?
honestly. I don't know.
Was he rich? Was he a rich guy?
I don't know anything.
This sounds like poor people cope.
Yeah, I was just trying to reference it, but I don't even think I referenced it right. So
Yeah. We
but
could have a
yeah,
whole podcast.
Maybe
on
someone knows in the comments. You could drop a comment. Please correct me. I'm ill-informed. Or I try to be informed, but I'm still ill-informed.
Who was so jealous of rich people he wanted to tell them that they weren't going to go to heaven unless they gave him all his money? That's
you
the
can
guy
let us
I'm
know in the
looking for.
comments.
I think it was Galileo, but I can't remember.
Do you think that depression links to imposter syndrome in any way?
I think that imposter syndrome can yield depression for sure.
Yeah.
I think it's usually one informing the other. You know, I feel like depression needs to stem from some stimulus. Something has to make you feel depressed. So,
Yeah.
you know, I have no money, I'm depressed. I have to go to work all day, every day, I'm depressed. My girlfriend broke up with me, so I'm depressed, right?
Right.
It's not just like,
It's
man,
the feeling of a lack of options. It's like you're stuck, right? Or at least that's how kind of Hormozy poses it.
I think that's how he poses it, yeah. And that's fair. It's like you've got nothing going on.
Or you feel like your options are limited and you want to have more.
Yeah. I think that's fair. But usually you have to have that lack of options. So you have options and then you lose them and now you feel depressed, right?
Right.
It's the loss. That's the action. That's the stimulus. So for imposter syndrome, it is big fish in a small pond. I'm at college. I'm getting all A's. I'm happy. And then little fish in a big pond. I'm being called a chemist at a laboratory. I don't know what any of these machines are. I'm being referred to all our suppliers and customers as a chemist.
Yeah.
And I don't know the answers to any of these questions. And, you know, if I don't have the answers, then how am I going to find them? And I don't know. And am I going to be found out? And that's a lack of options.
Do you think there's an argument to be made that imposter syndrome is mostly experienced by like high achievers or low achievers? Because those are kind of like the big fish in a little pond or the small fish in a big pond. Like, do you think that those are the two main groups that it might reside in? Or do you think it still kind of sits in the middle with like the normies, as we've been referring to?
I would almost like to say that it's the normies rather than the extremities, because if you're a high achiever and you achieve a high achieving position, you've met your goal, which was the goal in the first place. But if you're a low achiever, what's the likelihood that you actually get anywhere?
What's the likelihood that you really
Oh,
feel like you're not in the right spot?
Right. And I almost feel like low achievers, if you drop a low achiever into a successful position, like let's say some of the guys we graduated with who got engineering degrees who were low achievers and really didn't fucking deserve it, but got it anyways, right? Frank, if you're listening, Frank at his engineering job probably feels like he fucking deserves it because he earned it, even though he didn't really. He didn't deserve it, but he still earned it. So he's got a sense of arrogance, right?
Right.
So Frank is a low achiever who is avoiding imposter syndrome because he's so stupid that he doesn't even know that he doesn't deserve it. He's arrogant, right? But a high achiever, like my buddy Sander, who got good grades in college and then got a good job out of college, doesn't really feel a sense of imposter syndrome. I'm putting words in your mouth.
Yeah,
because you
it's true though. I don't. Yeah.
Right. But a middle achiever, right? Maybe someone who got okay grades, but wasn't really great in college. Maybe like myself, who then went on to be an engineer.
You did well. Definitely in the last 2 years.
Maybe in the last 2 years.
Yeah.
But let's just take High School Mason, right? Because I definitely felt like an imposter.
Yeah. I didn't know High School Mason, so this is on Mason.
High School Mason was fuck it. But High School Mason did not get grades good enough, he felt, to get into college. And then he got into college and then was a college student for engineering. And people started calling him an engineer, even though he hadn't earned the title yet. He's just in college for it. He can still fail out. But people have more faith in him than he does in himself. And I think that that's really what imposter syndrome can be broken down to. It's people have more confidence in you than you do.
Mm-hmm.
And it's attributed to you because of the labels that someone puts on you. So when I'm in college and I'm a college student, that's how I label myself. But someone labels me as an engineering student or an engineer, that makes me really uncomfortable because labels are meant to refine what someone is. Like if you take a random person off the street and I go, this is a garbage man, right? You automatically are supposed to come up with a bunch of ideas about what he is because now you know he's a garbage man. So maybe he knows how to drive one of those big trucks. Maybe he's strong because he lifts those garbage cans all day. Maybe he smells because he works with garbage all day, right? But what ends up happening is instead of narrowing down all of the different options that it could be to a small subset, you're actually taking that small subset and then attributing them to him, which is challenging because instead of refining the view of options to somebody and then stimulating new ideas from that, you're kind of forcing those attributes onto someone beforehand. So I really hated getting the engineer label put on me, or the rower label even, because a lot of engineers are really arrogant, have a big ego, and a lot of rowers are wealthy and think that they're better than other people. And I really didn't want to meet someone new and be introduced as an engineer or rower, because there are a lot of negative attributes assigned to those people. And I don't want those people automatically assuming that I have those attributes.
Right.
So I almost feel like imposter syndrome stems from people putting a label on you and having more faith in your abilities than really you do.
Very interesting.
Yeah. So that, in summary, I think is how you get imposter syndrome. But what is your strategy on how to avoid it?
So I wrote down things kind of more in line of how to fix it. And then through that, I think you can see how to avoid it. That's kind of how I approach that question.
Sure.
My answer is 4 different parts. So I have 4 different little segments that each kind of work towards getting out of it or avoiding it entirely. So I'll start with the first one here. I think this actually links well to the point you just made, is detaching your self-worth from external validation. So if you are able to take yourself as just the person you are and detach it from other people's opinions about you, or these labels that you mentioned, or like what people think you should know versus what people think you shouldn't know and stuff like that. And to kind of just analyze yourself and who you are, I think that's a good step to either avoiding it or getting out of it if you're in it, right?
I think the two are synonymous. Avoidance and then getting out of it is the same answer.
Yeah, that's kind of why I grouped those two together. Excuse me. But I think that, as you mentioned earlier as well, a lack of confidence and then a lack of self-reflection leads to you seeking validation from others. And one point I kind of wanted to make a little bit before I get your feedback on the idea is no one witnesses the picture as fully as you do. So I'm kind of making a metaphor for like if your life was a picture, like a movie story, right? And you were going through this movie and you had all these different pictures in your life of different events that you'd encountered and stuff that you'd done versus failures that you'd had and whatever. No one witnesses the picture as fully as you do, but you have to see the picture too, right? And the point I'm kind of trying to make is that you can witness yourself go through these actions and do these great things that should be evidence for your future actions. But if you don't really see that, if you don't concretely actually feel it inside of you, I think that can lead to imposter syndrome, because it's that kind of like that wall between what is the evidence there, what is the analysis there, where's the self-reflection, and like what you're feeling, which is kind of this like shut down or like I'm not supposed to be here feeling. You can't access that. So it's like you can witness your life, but you have to be able to see it too.
Right.
Right. What are your thoughts on that? Do you think you have a similar approach? Do you have this a component of like separating yourself from external validation into your like avoidance or your solution to imposter syndrome?
My approach is a little different, but it's less introspective. Those are the first 2 parts, right?
That was actually half of one part.
Okay, keep going.
Okay, cool. So the point I actually kind of want to extend through this kind of like witness idea versus seeing idea is other people's perception of you often can be an unreliable narrative. Other people can either add to the truth, they can detract from it, and anything in between, which creates an unbalance of both negative and positive feedback in your direction. And I think that it's kind of like if you were talking to a parent. This is really common, where it's like you ask them one thing and you think it's going to go well, but they give you all this negative feedback. And then you ask them another thing that you think is going to go poorly, but then they give you all this positive feedback. And so it feels like this like
crazy mesh of like, you can't predict how they're going to feel about X circumstance. And then so you start to feel kind of like shut down. And like imposter syndrome, I think, has a component of it that's like you're shutting down a little bit, right?
Mm-hmm.
But the kind of like the deeper point I'm trying to make is that when other people perceive you and push that perception onto you, like labels,
Mm-hmm.
right? You start to feel like you get your purpose and your meaning and your place from other people. And when other people are unpredictable or unreliable in their narrative to you, then of course you're going to feel like an imposter, because you feel like you're being pulled in all these misdirections that you don't understand, right? And I think the core difference that separates people who suffer from imposter syndrome and people who don't, on top of like that self-reflection, self-analysis portion, is that confidence component that you mentioned earlier, and we talked about last week too, which is kind of funny. But confident people can correct the other people that are giving them that feedback, or just take it as their opinion and it is what it is. But people who are not confident take it to heart and try to force that perception of themselves onto themselves.
Mm-hmm.
And there's bound to be a contradiction between other people's narratives and how it's pushed onto them.
Can I add something to that?
Yes, that is my whole point too.
Have you ever seen, that's all of it? The whole
That's
thing?
one.
Okay, got it. The whole first point.
Yeah.
Have you seen The Big Bang Theory? The TV show?
No. I've seen like clips.
The premise of The Big Bang Theory is there are 4 friends. They're all like physicists and like doctors and stuff. And one of them is like trying to solve the Big Bang Theory.
Okay.
Right? So how did the universe start? And it's a comedy, so it's funny. But one of the recurring shticks, one of the recurring gimmicks is that one of them is the 3 of them are. 2 of them are theoretical physicists. One of them is an astrophysicist, and one of them is an engineer.
Okay.
They all have their doctorates, but the physicist shit on the engineer because he's not a physicist, he's an engineer. So his doctorate doesn't really count. So he's not really a doctor, he's an engineer. The rest of them are doctors. But it's a recurring joke, right?
Yeah.
Because technically the term is the same, but the physicist has more of an ego, so they think that their doctor means more, right?
Yeah.
And you can succumb to the imposter syndrome of thinking that you're not really a doctor because your degree is lesser in the eyes of others, but really the name PhD still goes next to your name.
Yeah.
So who really cares?
Yeah. Yeah. And I mean, like, I guess at the same time too, if you have the experience and you've gone through the school and the education,
right,
and you are, have a doctorate, then you are by fact a doctor, right?
Exactly.
You don't have to take a physicist's perspective or someone else's perspective on like how much your doctorate is worth.
So
right.
If you're a college graduate who studied chemistry and now you're working in a lab, you're a chemist. Whether or not you think you're a good chemist is up to you, right?
Right.
Some doctors graduated college with a D. You know what I mean? It doesn't
True.
just because you're a doctor doesn't
These
mean
get
you're a good
degrees.
doctor. Exactly.
Yeah.
But it all depends on your self-perception of it. You can either say I'm a chemist and I'm working on becoming a better chemist, or you can say I don't know if I deserve the title of chemist because other people are better at chemistry.
Right. Right. Do you want me to go through the other points I have, or do you want to jump in?
Mm-hmm.
Okay. Another important component to avoiding imposter syndrome or solving it, if you're experiencing that, in my opinion, is accepting failure as part of growth. I think that an important note to make is that when you're thinking, I ordered these in a specific way too, because I wanted to start with, you have to get rid of the external validation portion. You have to validate within yourself. You can't be relying on other people who are poor narrators of your life, right? You have to look at yourself and self-reflect, right? And then on top of that, I want to add that accepting failure is important because most people want to see you fail more than they want to see themselves succeed, right? And so I think that raises an important point with the kind of external validation is like, if you're getting external validation from people who don't have your best interest in mind, then of course that's going to lead to problems, how you feel inside and how you feel about what you can achieve versus cannot achieve, all right? I heard this awesome quote on a Modern Wisdom podcast. I actually saw it in a TikTok short today. Haters are holding their breath, waiting for you to fail. Make sure they suffocate. And I love that quote. But I don't want to make it sound like you cannot make mistakes or you cannot fail, because I genuinely believe that the only time you can really fail is when you completely give up And I think that reaching to other people for validation is like the first step to giving up. So don't do that. Look at yourself, self-reflect, analyze, and try to grow from your mistakes and learn from those things. And I think additionally, what's important is that you can focus on growth effectively by reframing failure into a success or into a benefit, right? They're like everything happens for a reason kind of idea, right? And self-reflection and analysis and growth through that process is super important. Now, once you have once you've thrown away external validation, once you've started to accept failure as a part of your growth and not given up and succumbed to other people's opinions about what you're doing or why, it's important to put emphasis on actions over feelings, because it's very easy to get worked up into a negative mindset when you feel something bad, or it's even easy to get worked up into a super positive mindset that might way far extend what is actually the truth, right? You could have imposter syndrome where you're a big fish in a small pond or a small fish in a big pond, right? And so it's so easy to get worked up into this that you internally in your mind through these feelings. And I want to raise a specific point to a negative mindset, because I think that negative mindset kind of fosters that need to look at someone else for your validation. Because if you can't find the positivity inside of you, you're going to look up for positivity in other people. But if other people are unreliable and they're giving all these mixed signals, then like, what is it really worth? You know what I mean?
Right.
And I think that actually that kind of component of emphasis on actions over feelings, it also kind of ties into the idea that we've discussed before as well, which is bad things come in threes, right? It's not actually that bad things come in threes. It's that people experience one bad situation and then they let that get the best of them. They let their feelings get the best of them and they don't analyze it. They just feel terrible. And so another bad thing happens. So like, let's say they get into let's say they forget or they didn't properly fill out their IRS forms, and then they find a bunch of money, and then they get into a car accident because they're stressed out. And then because they're stressed out about the car accident, they run over both their laptops, right? Just a theory. But, these things in threes, you have to be able to learn from your mistakes and just accept it as this is one thing. It is what it is, but I'm going to push past this and I'm going to grow, right? And the way to get through that and to kind of the way to start learning how to look at your actions analytically rather than living by your feelings is to continue to create, innovate, and push yourself. There's the kind of anecdote about you have to break a few eggs to make an omelet, right? I changed it up a little bit and I said you have to break some logs to build a bridge, right? Because I kind of wanted to paint that picture of you're crossing bridges as you're going through these challenges and these paths, right? So I kind of changed it up for you and the audience, but you have to go through that process. And once you have those three down, once you have detracted yourself from external validation, once you have accepted failure as a part of your growth and that you cannot give up, and then you have to look at your actions over your feelings, you focus on creating value through your actions. So, you could do actions like, let's say you have the first three down, but then the actions that you're doing are like something maybe silly, like you do jumping jacks every time you see your car, or like, you do a little spin every single time it's 7 o'clock, right? Like little, like meaningless actions, right? Okay. Like the point I'm trying to make is that your actions have to be meaningful. They have to have value, because from that value stems a really important component to fighting imposter syndrome, which is the evidence. Right? You can't get evidence from just silly actions that you do routinely every day. Right? And so learning to self-reflect and then focusing on creating meaning and value through your actions by journaling, looking at other people's motivational quotes online or listening to motivational podcasts.
Listening to the Vision 79 podcast.
That's right. Posting maybe sheets around your house that have motivational phrases on them from other people or even from your own mind that you find inspiring. And then continuing to pursue meaningful ends as you go through this process will acclimate you more and more to the undeniable proof that you can do anything you put your mind to. And that is like the final nail I want to put in, at least kind of like my framing of this point is, if you continue to pursue through these things, you will build an undeniable stack of proof in order to send yourself forward into the next tasks at hand. That is my very long-winded answer to how to avoid imposter syndrome or how to fix it if you're stuck in it.
Do you know what I wrote down?
No.
Build an undeniable stack of proof that you are who you say you are. Outwork
There
your
you go.
self-doubt. That's pretty much it. That's what I have. So
Yeah.
you have like a full explanation for what my quote
I wrote
means.
a small dissertation, but
Yeah, no,
in
but it was
reality, in reality, it literally just comes down to building an undeniable stack of proof.
But it explains what that means. It doesn't just
Yeah.
say it, because that could mean to some people out there who don't really understand what building an undeniable stack of proof means. That quote is meaningless, right?
Right.
It's kind of like, back to the religion thing. It's like, well, be a better person and you'll go to heaven. It's like, how do I be a better person? How do I build an undeniable stack of proof? And I think that it's important to understand where you're at and pursue your goals, following all the methods that you just laid out to actually effectively do that. So it's operationalizing building an undeniable stack of proof, which is valuable.
Yeah.
The big one that resonates for me is not
That's kind of why. Sorry, that's
ahead.
kind of why I threw in the stuff about like journaling or listening to motivational podcasts or putting stuff up on your wall. I want to give you guys something that you can actually do that are actionable steps in order to solve this kind of issue if you're experiencing it.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah. The one that resonated with me was not caring what other people think. And that's interesting because imposter syndrome largely is leveraged off of what other people say about you.
Right.
And
Labels.
yeah. Labels. And something that most of my heroes have in common is just not really giving a shit what other people say or think or feel about them.
Max Verstappen.
Yeah, pretty much, right? And that's really big. Max Verstappen, I can guarantee you, doesn't have imposter syndrome because he doesn't give a shit whether or not you think or feel like he belongs there, because he knows that he does, because he has an undeniable stack of proof.
Right.
But I didn't identify not caring what other people think. That's a fun one that I hadn't considered before.
Very cool. Well, I'm glad I brought something new for you.
Yeah.
So I tried to kind of build a system out of this to
No, it's good.
touch on the points that I thought were important when it comes to this sort of thing. Because I think that, this is I think that maybe I've rambled a little bit in this podcast from like point to point in terms of like self-reflection and stuff like that. But I think by and large, the reason that I'm rambling a little bit is because I want this to really sink in. If any people out there are struggling with this sort of thing, I really want the solutions and the concept of this problem to really sink into people so that they can understand it, analyze it, and see it in themselves.
Okay.
I think that's super important.
So then let's take the one that stuck out for me in not caring what other people think, and let's break that down, because you struggled with that for a while the other year.
Yeah.
You struggled with caring too much about what other people thought. Talk to me through that. And this kind of bleeds into the third segment, but we'll start with this.
Yeah, I think that a couple of things that I did to try and so I was really hooked on what other people's opinions of me, especially like family. If family thought one thing, then like I felt as though I had to think that thing, or if I felt like I needed to do something that I felt like there was this umbrella obligation under me for me to complete this task without thinking about it or analyzing it in any way, and kind of how I don't want to say I broke it up, but what I did was I took those feelings and I turned them from feelings into analysis and reason. So I took them away from like the kind of the emotional side of me that just gets like upset or caught up or stuck into this box that I don't know if I want to be in or not, and I morphed them into analysis. And so I did that by, I think that you got me to go to therapy, which was, I think that there has been some benefit from that for sure. Just to kind of like the process of talking through your experiences and talking through how you think, even if your therapist or whoever you're talking to doesn't provide like 10 or 11 out of 10 solutions every single time, they are a backboard for those things. And in that 1 hour block that you have, it is literally your space to self-reflect and look back on yourself, right? So having that kind of backboard is really important. Yeah.
There have been studies done on verbalizing your internal stream of conscience.
Yeah.
And one of the reasons that therapy works is because speaking your internal thoughts and feelings that you're not sure you agree with aloud actually process those emotions in your brain.
Yeah.
Not even getting feedback on them, but just saying them. So like waking up in the morning and when you walk into the office, if you feel neutral, but someone asks how you're doing and you say, oh, I'm tired, you start to feel more tired, right? So everything that you speak aloud, your body starts to align with. But similarly, I think this was also done, and they had like a therapy session in an MRI machine or something. But your brain actually starts to settle down as you talk about your problems, even if the therapist just goes, yeah, and like doesn't even provide any feedback, but just talking about what's on your mind out loud processes that in your brain.
Yeah. A professor in high school once told me that the formation of a good question is 80% of the way to an answer. Right.
Formation of a good question is 80% of the way to the answer.
Yeah, because if you're able to think about it enough to form a really good, insightful question, you are almost at the answer because you've already gone through so much of the process to actually analyze whatever situation you're talking about.
That's a method that I used in college. I made myself sit at the front of the classroom and try to come up with questions because I knew if I could come up with questions, it means I was paying enough attention to come up with a question, which means that I'm paying some amount of attention. And even if I am not understanding what's being like, even if it's a dumbass question, I'm still engaged enough to ask it and I'll still learn. Right. If you get one question answered in your lecture, you learn something from that lecture and you won't drown. Right. But that's an interesting thought, is that the answer is 80% of the way there to understanding.
I think another thing that helped me a little bit was having something that you do just for yourself. It could be
jerking off. I'm kidding.
I do that for other people.
It's terrible.
Like, for example,
for
journaling. Yeah, for the kids. It's for the boys.
Journaling.
It could be reading. It could be working on your car. It could be working on a Excel sheet of fitness tracking, like kind of what you do. It could
go to the gym.
Tracking your finances, going to the gym. It could be just something that you do for you and you can consistently look at that thing just from yourself and look at that thing and go, okay, what improvements have I made? And if you continue to do it, you will undoubtedly make improvements in how you do it, right? That is, if you do it more, you will get better, right? And so I think that it's the important point I want to make with doing something for yourself specifically is that if you're just doing it for you and you keep it within yourself, there is zero possibility for external factors to come into play and influence how you feel about it, right? So I think that that's an important step to getting away from being too influenced by what other people think you should do or how you should act or blah, blah, blah. In addition to that, what I did, I think, as I mentioned many times, probably the audience is sick of hearing it, but installing the different methods that we've talked about to implement a mindset of analysis inside of you. I think once you start to implement that analysis mindset, you'll see yourself looking at things in a more analytical way, which I believe is a more rewarding way as well. Because even if you realize that you're wrong about something, it gives you the opportunity to fix it and recognize it, right? Like we've talked a lot on the podcast about recognizing your failures and taking responsibility for those. I think that you can either look at failures and get emotional about it, or you can look at failures analytically and see what you did wrong in order to build that evidence to get you to the next thing. Right. And also, when you start looking at things analytically for yourself, other people's emotional impact on you no longer has as much weight, because you will start to recognize that looking at things from an evidence standpoint is a more rational and logical way to approach problems than the input you're getting from external factors, which is largely emotional, like other people wanting you to fail more than they want to see themselves succeed, or haters holding their breath, waiting for you to fail, and you making sure that they suffocate in that process. Right. I think those are probably the three things that I would recommend for someone for how to break down putting too much weight on external factors that are just not in your control.
Yeah, it's almost like you don't need to stop caring about what other people think. You just need to start caring about what you think more. And then that will shrink your dependence on others' approval into insignificance. Right. It's kind of like how instead of letting your haters suffocate, it's kind of like you just grow so large that your haters shrink into insignificance.
Right. Yeah. That's a great way of putting it too.
Right.
I think that's Hormozy has something similar. Yeah.
It's Hermosish.
Hermosish. Yeah, there you go. But that's what I have.
Okay, let's
for
how to avoid
getting
it.
rid of imposter syndrome or avoid it.
Let's bleed into our personal experiences with it. Now that we've defined what it is and how to avoid it, I want to start talking about real world examples in which we've encountered it, either ourselves or people around us. I think that imposter syndrome implies some anxiety, which for me personally is kind of rare. I think that when I was younger, I would really frequently overpromise and then figure it out. And like while I was overpromising, I was like, I'll figure it out. So I would go home and tell my parents, like, I'm going to get A's on this report card, all A's, I'm going to do it. And I know that I haven't submitted homework in 3 weeks and that I haven't prepared for the test on Friday. And I would just make the promise and then figure out a way to make it work. And I was actually worried when I was going into college.
It's almost like manifestation, but with like less evidence.
Delusion. Yeah.
Yeah.
I was really worried. I was like,
That's
man,
manifestation through delusion.
Yeah.
That's kind of a funny one.
Well, after I graduated from college, my parents confided in me and they were like, we're so happy that you wrote in college because we were afraid you were going to become a frat guy. And I was like, man, that would have been really awesome and terrible. I think I would have become a scam artist immediately because I could run a hell of a Ponzi scheme, like just taking money from Jack and paying off Jill.
Right.
Because I would overpromise and then figure it out so often when I was younger. So like I spoke about this example in a previous podcast, but with my high school rowing team, rowing boats with 2 oars instead of 1 is reserved for the older students. And when I was in like, I don't know, my freshman or sophomore year of high school, I lied to my coach and told her I knew how to do it. So she would put me in one of those boats. And then I pulled the head coach's rowing magazine off of his workbench and read that magazine in the bathroom to try to figure out how to do it before launching at practice. And I figured it out. So and I feel like eventually that was bound to burn my ass at some point because I would way over promise and then like way under deliver and I don't know, go to prison. But I think I have grown comfortable accepting that I might not have it all figured out, but I have the ability to figure it out. And I don't need to lie to someone to sell them on it. So if I need someone's help with a project, I don't need to lie to them and tell them I have it all figured out. I have the answer. I just need your help to get there. I can be like, hey, I don't know how to do it, but I've done other shit before and figuring it out is going to take 2 weeks. I'm going to figure it out in 2 weeks and then we can do this. And I've had to make some of those promises with the rowing team recently. Because it's tough to fire your main coaches and then stack all that pressure on the remaining coaches. But we were able to get them to stay because they know me. And I told them, listen, I'm going to find supplemental support to come in and help you. But I need you to stay to run this team while I do that. Do you have confidence that I will find you people? And they did, and they stayed and it worked. But I feel like if you have honesty in, hey, dude, I don't have it figured out right now. I'm going to figure it out. Here's my process. That works better than blindly saying, I got to handle, dude, bro. I got 15 people on the phone right now. Like lying makes it worse.
Yeah. Yeah. I think this ties in really well to the point we made last week, which was as you go through life and you overcome challenges, you build a stack of proof in yourself to accomplish tasks even if you don't know exactly how to do them, with honesty, self-reflection, and analysis.
Yeah.
Right? And I think that the point last week we made was it kind of connected to confidence, and this week we're kind of connecting it to how to get out of imposter syndrome or how to not feel like an imposter yourself, as well as talking a little bit about, our experiences through that.
Yeah. I think most of the times I've felt imposter syndrome, though, haven't been when I've overpromised and then figured out how to deliver, because I'm putting myself in that situation. So I'm aware of my inabilities to make this work. I think usually I experience it when someone else places me in a position, but even then I kind of blame it on them. So in our senior year of college, when I was suing Florida Tech for the rowing program, the president of SGA asked me to run for the athletics liaison position in SGA. Mm-hmm. So I did. And while I was giving my pitch for the student government to vote me in, all of these people started asking me really aggressive questions and like flaming me because they didn't like that I was suing the school. So I looked at Carolyn, the president, and I was like, the fuck is the deal here? And she was like, guys, like, I'm asking him to be here. He doesn't have the answers to all these questions. He's not a dick. Like, you know, he's not here because it's a power grab. He's here because I literally asked him to be there. And my reaction wasn't like, oh, I don't belong here, or I'm incompetent or whatever. It's like, I'm doing you a favor by being here. You can give me whatever label you want and I'll figure it out. But I don't feel that I deserve this. I feel like I'm almost doing you a favor. I think the only time I've really truly felt imposter syndrome is when I got to college, and in my sophomore year, my mom started referring to me as an engineer. And I was like, cut that shit out. You're going to jinx it. I could fail all my classes. And then I did start failing all my classes. Sophomore year, I was actually like 30%, 25% classes. Like that was my grade in the classes.
Yeah,
I was like, oh shit, I'm actually failing out of this. And all these people are already like, they're jumping the gun. They're giving me credit for something I haven't accomplished yet. And I'm not sure I can even accomplish it at this point. I think that's the only time I've really felt it.
It's funny that you bring up SGA stuff in this, because the one example that really stood out to me in terms of imposter syndrome was when we went to that club awards meeting for like awards of like best president, best vice president. And I don't remember if you were drinking, but I was definitely drunk. And I stole a plate that the chocolate cake was on.
We stole two.
Because when I was in there, I felt so wrong. I was like, I should not be here. I'm wasted. I just came here for free food. I'm not going to get anything. Like, all these people are serious, and I'm friggin' joking around about the people on stage.
Dude,
like, that was, I was like, I don't deserve to be here. This is terrible.
Do you remember at the beginning of that year, there was something that all club leadership had to go to, like the seminar at the beginning of the year?
Yes. It's like the instructional seminar.
It was like an 8-hour all-day seminar where you sit and listen to them fucking yap. And we left at the lunch break to go to the gas station to buy beer, and then poured it into
C4,
into empty C4 cans and drank for the second half of it. And the second half was way more time.
Oh yeah, the second half was great.
But yeah, that was another situation where I was like, but again, it's like, you have called me to be here. Like, I feel like an imposter because I have literally been sat down here, and, you know, it's almost like, I guess I've never really felt imposter syndrome, because if anybody came up and asked me like, do you feel like you deserve to be here? I would be like, no, I was told to come. And I feel like imposter syndrome for people is when they feel they should say yes, but they don't for whatever reason. You know?
Yeah.
It's like, oh, well, technically I deserve to be here, but I just don't know enough or whatever.
Right.
It's an odd position to climb into. And honestly, I think it's easier to define how to avoid imposter syndrome than it is to define getting it.
Yeah.
Like if I were
interesting dilemma.
Yeah, coming up with examples of people who have imposter syndrome is challenging. And like, if you told me, like, you know, that we've got two kids sitting in front of us, one of them has imposter syndrome and one of them doesn't, and we need to take it away from the person who has it and then give it to the person who does, I can help the kid with imposter syndrome get rid of it, but the kid who doesn't, I don't know how to give it to you.
Do you think that's because the kid who doesn't have it has a wall of like self-confidence and self-reflection and analysis that's harder to break down?
Probably, yeah. Because you can put a hard hat on that kid and then throw him in the middle of a construction site and tell him he's the crane operator and stick him in the seat. But when you do that, he's not going to know what the fuck he's doing, and he'll probably say right away, I don't know what the fuck I'm doing. And then they'll pull him out of there.
Right.
Right.
I had one example of when I think a lot of people would have had imposter syndrome and I didn't feel it. I had one of those examples. It was when I went to the IndyCar race in St. Petersburg a couple years ago. I got these pit passes that I bid on at a Formula SE auction sophomore year. And I got these passes, and it gave me access to like the Penske paddock area. It gave me access to like the actual space where they're, you know, doing the pit stops and whatever. It gave me access to like all the inner workings of the pit and like all these different like special little areas and whatever. And I did not feel like an imposter at all. I was like, I am so at home. This is so awesome. I walked up to Mario Andretti when he was standing in pit road, and I walked up to him and had him sign my shirt while he was talking to news reporters about other stuff. Like, I was just like, this is my space. I'm so happy to be here. But I think a lot of people would have felt like, I'm not supposed to walk up to Mario Andretti. Why, like, am I in these pits? Why did I get these tickets? Like, I don't feel like I fit in here. I was just like, like, awesome racing, great time, access to a bunch of cool shit. I'm game. Let's go.
Yeah.
Right? And I think that was like a time where like I didn't feel that. I think a lot of my struggle has come from not being able to detach myself from external validation, as well as a negative internal voice that builds, and I have a hard time breaking that down, and it becomes overwhelming for me. And I think that leads into kind of like this depressive, sad state that I feel sometimes, where the negative voice is so strong that I can't see the positive voice. For example, like if I oversleep my alarms in the morning, I already feel like I've failed my entire day, although I have a vast majority of my day still remaining.
Right.
But I get this negative mindset where it's like, you fail yourself, like you didn't get up in the morning on time. What the fuck are you doing? Like, how can you do this? Like, you're wasting your day, you're wasting your time. And then I get into the negative headspace, and then I seek like small dopamine hits, like scrolling TikTok or something like that, that continues to waste my time and detract from the time I have left to be able to do the things that I actually wanted to do that day. It's like, if I was able to just reset myself and look at the positive, I would be able to get on with the rest of my day and probably accomplish everything that I intended to do that day. But I get wrapped up into this negative mindset that I don't feel like I should, or don't feel like I am capable of doing it, because I'm just succumbed by this like feeling of failure, even though that's not like factually the case. And that's something that I try to fight with analysis, analytical reasoning, journaling, talking out, and using the failures as growth for tomorrow. Right. But that's something that I'm still trying to push through actively.
The Mario Andretti story is so funny, because I hadn't even considered what are instances where I should feel imposter syndrome but felt the opposite. And I feel that the majority of my life is that. It's like other people saying you shouldn't be here, you don't deserve it, and then me saying like, you know, walk into a room with confidence and act like you own the place and no one's going to say anything, right?
Right.
Like when we snuck into the BMW tower at the roller store.
Right.
You just walk in, you're like, I got a pass, whatever.
Or
like, it's not a real pass, it's someone else's, but...
Didn't you tell me about a story? You were at a car show and you got into an area or got to see some cars. I thought you had a similar story to mine, because I snuck in to see the F40. I think you snuck into like, it was like a Bugatti or a McLaren or something like that. I had that story where I snuck in to see the F40 and I was in an area I was supposed to, because I just acted like I was supposed to be there.
Yeah. So I was at, I visited my friend in Georgia after graduating high school. And the McLaren 600 LT had just come out recently, and I really wanted to sit in one. So he and I walked into this McLaren dealership, and we were looking at all the cars. We're fucking, 18, and I'm dressed as any 18-year-old, shorts and a t-shirt. And my buddy's in a McLaren shirt, which we had bought at the Cars and Coffee car show that morning. And one of the ladies working there came up to us and she's like, "Can I help you?" And I was like, "I'd like to sit in the 600 LT, please." And she was like, all right, let me get our manager. Don't touch the car. I was like, okay. And I waited, and he and I waited for 3 hours.
Yeah.
And I think at first she didn't get the manager. And then after an hour, she was like, oh, they're not going to leave. And so then she got the manager. So the manager came out, and he was like, I had already talked to my buddy about this, because he was like, dude, do we tell them that our dads are millionaires? And then I was like, no, we're just going to be honest. Maybe he'll take pity on us. And he came out and he was like, hey, I hear you guys have been waiting for a while. Can I help you with anything? And I was like, I want to sit in the car. And he was like, are you buying? And I was like, no, honestly, I'm just a fan, but it just came out and I'd really like to. I showered before this. I'm clean. I'm not going to dirty up the car. And he was like, okay, I'll let you sit in it. So he let us sit in it. But the BMW tower is a really great example of sneaking into somewhere that I don't belong. I'm sure there are dozens of other ones that I can't remember. A big one is when I started at Northrop Grumman, I was 21 with secret government clearance. And so what all the other interns would do every day is go in and sit at their desk and then wait to be told what to do and then do it. And as soon as I got there, someone would come up to me and then hand me a task. And then I would tell them, this is probably going to take me all day. I'll get back to you tomorrow morning. And they were like, okay. And they left just like everyone else's. But instead of doing the work and then being done early, I would just put the work aside. And then I was like, how do I find the aliens? Like, what do I have access to with what does this clearance give me? Like, what's all the shit I can look through? So I would dig through all the online files and then in the in-person cabinets. And then I would go try to find the security closets with like all the cool merchandise and shit in it. And I'd test out what doors I have access to or not. All the sus shit that you shouldn't do With the security clearance is exactly what I did, because wherever I'm at, whatever access I have, I want to know the limits of it, right? If you buy a new car, you want to know exactly what it can do so you know how fast you go, right? So you test the limits. And obviously with a security
I've never owned a
clearance-
car that I haven't tested the top speed on outside of the 335.
Exactly, right? Exactly.
Yeah.
But you did start, the 335, yeah.
Yeah.
I was
that
gonna
one
say,
I never did.
I was going to say you tried the stopping distance on the 330, but
yeah, that one I tested too.
that's the one that
I actually shortened the stopping distance from the factory specification by quite a bit.
Yeah. And, sometimes I push the limits more than others. So, like with the security clearance thing, I don't push so far that I break the rules or anything, because that's a federal crime. But when it comes to sneaking into the BMW tower at the Daytona 24, right? If I'm fucking, 20 years old and don't have any money, and we can pool our money to get one ticket to try to sneak in, like I think that's fine. If I were the owner of the BMW tower, I would give those kids a pass and tell them to not come back next year. You know what I mean?
Right.
But I think that it's interesting, because how many people with imposter syndrome miss out on huge swaths of life because they're afraid that they don't belong there and they shouldn't do it, even though they have access to and can.
Yeah.
So, like, how many kids had those pit passes that you did and then didn't meet Mario Andretti because they didn't want to go up?
Right. Or was something that I realized, actually, I experienced this yesterday. I was at the HSR 24, and
A homosexual race? HS?
no, no homosexuals there. Burly men.
Just the one.
Yeah. But I experienced this yesterday where I was walking around the pit and I was kind of treating it like the Rolex, where it's like you walk up to the line, you be polite, you don't walk in, you don't bother people, you just do your thing. And I started noticing other people walking into the pits and looking around the cars and getting closer to them and stuff like that. And I was like, what is the consequence of me walking through? Like, the worst case scenario, like, I get yelled at and told to, like, step back or whatever, right? But I was like, I see other people do it. And I was like, this is a pretty low-key event. There's a lot less people here. Everyone's laid back. It's all, like, older guys who just love racing and just paid to be here and race their cars. Like, as long as I'm polite, I think they'll let me walk through.
Mm-hmm.
And so then I started walking through the pits, and, like, I very quickly acclimated to, like, just kind of being in the pit and walking around the car and chatting with people and whatever. And it's like, I think a lot of people would have experienced imposter syndrome, where they've been like, I shouldn't be here, this is wrong and whatever. But I kind of looked at the situation analytically, and I saw a stark contrast between, like, the vibes of the Rolex 24 versus the vibes of the HSR 24. And I was like, I can kind of like be my own person and kind of like walk around here and I'll be fine, right? Mm-hmm. But I think that if you would have thrown me in that situation 2 years ago, I would have never even gotten to the analytical point of analyzing the differences between the two, and I would have never even thought to cross that line.
Yeah.
Right. But as you start to break down the need for external validation and accept, the failures of maybe getting yelled at the pits as part of the growth, and to learning what you can and cannot do, and putting emphasis on your actions over the negative feelings that you feel, as well as focusing on value through your actions, like making cool connections with people, talking about the 914 brakes, looking at these awesome cars that you maybe haven't seen before, or haven't seen this up close or whatever, like creating value and doing all these other things, you start to build that internal self-confidence, and you break down that wall between how you feel and your analytical reasoning and thought.
Yeah. It's interesting, because a really easy way to combat it is literally just to ask, what's the worst that can happen?
Right.
Like, what's the worst that can happen by using a fake pass for the BMW tower? It doesn't scan. They detain you. They figure out you don't have a real ticket, and then they kick you out of the racetrack. Okay, so be it. Worth the loss, right?
And that's like a real extreme too.
That's like, really extreme, right? And in think of in most case scenarios, the worst that can happen is that maybe you get yelled at and kicked out. And if you woke up sick that day, you wouldn't be there anyways. So you're not really missing out on anything. And so many people are afraid to be yelled at. So many people have not been yelled at enough in life. And I say that because I remember the last time that someone yelling at me really bothered me. Because in 6th grade, our teacher, Mr. Zavorsky, was preparing us for, I think, World War III. He was preparing us for deployment, because he was like, next year, you're 7th graders. You're going into middle school with all the other animals. The 8th graders will pull your pants down and fuck you every day. You need to be tough. You need to understand that you need to work or life will eat you. And I was like, oh my God. So I remember we had these things called data folders, which as a 24-year-old engineer, were not a big deal. But as a 10-year-old 6th grader, were a big deal. They were these gray plastic folders which looks like death because all of my other folders are bright colors. So a gray data folder with a fucking sticker with my like last name, first initial, and my fucking the number tattooed on my arm on this data folder was like so grim. And essentially what he had us do is he was like, hey, every hour of the day, just write down what you're working on. And that way, when you submit your homework, you can start to plan out what hours to work on your homework. Take it home, track. I remember the hours were tracked from like 8 a.m. to like 5 p.m. And school lets out at 3:30, so whatever. And I remember he was like, I'm going to check these at the first of the month. And so the entire month goes by, no one touches them. So he collects them at the first of the month and they're all empty. And he yells at the class because no one filled them out. And he was like, I expect these to be done at the end of the month or you will suffer. Your grades will suffer. I'll call your parents, whatever. And we were like, oh shit. So another month goes by, no one touches them. And so he gets them back again. And this time he's livid. I remember he like collects all of them and he's like happy. It's a happy day, whatever. We're like working on our times tables. And I remember he sits down and everyone is aware that he's going to start going through the data folders and everyone's clenching their ass because they know that they didn't do it and no one else did either. And I remember he opens the first one and he kind of looks through and he closes it and he pauses for a second and he puts it down and he opens the next one and then the next one. And he picks up the entire stack and fucking slams it on the table and he stands up and he goes, God damn it. And everyone just like fucking flinched and froze. And he spent the rest of the day calling the kids up one at a time. This is a middle school or a high school, a sixth grade classroom. So like you're sitting at tables and his desk is 10 feet that way, right? And he would have each of them sit down and he'd pull out your data folder and he'd open it up and he would just be like, do you want to explain this to me? Every single kid. And he would ridicule them. He gave every kid a tailored version of you're not going anywhere in life unless you fill out these data folders. And I remember he was wearing a purple polo shirt and had a blue coffee thermos with him. And I remember because in the fucking screaming session he gave to me, he was telling me, he was like, stop fucking crying. Next year in 7th grade, you're going to be a man and men don't fucking cry. I want you to fucking remember this. And he picked up the blue cup and the blue thermos and he was like, you're going to fucking remember this until you're 80 because it's the last time you cry when a man speaks to you. And then he put the thermos down. And I remember that to this day. And since then, I've not given a shit if people yelled at me.
Wow.
Yeah.
That's wild.
Yeah. It was fun. For a 6th grade teacher, it was fucking wild.
That is a crazy story.
Yeah. And so since then, it's kind of been like, well, what's the worst that can happen? Because Mr. Zavorsky's not going to yell at me again, so who cares, right?
Yeah.
But what's interesting is most case scenarios, the worst thing that can happen is you get yelled at. But some case scenarios, that's not the case. So some real world examples that I have not experienced, but I've heard other people experience. One of them is parenting. A lot of people who have a baby go on to say like, dude, I feel like I shouldn't have this. Especially men, I think. I've heard it a lot from men because men don't actually go through pregnancy. They just like, it's like pregnancy adjacent. So like the entire time that the woman is, you know, pregnant, she feels this connection with this baby. She gives birth and then she's connected to the thing that she's grown, right? But with the man, it's like there's nothing. And now you're holding a kid and it's yours. And a lot of them go through imposter syndrome then. And the worst part about that is that, well, now other people are judging you on your parenting skills and the consequences of what's the worst that can happen is your kid dies, which is a big fucking issue. And the other one I can think of is inspired by the Joe Rogan podcast with Trump, which was taking on the presidency. Because for the entire campaign, you're no one, and then you're the president of the United States. And the consequence is millions or billions of lives, depending on which buttons you push.
Yeah.
And those are crazy instances that I do not envy of potential imposter syndrome.
True. Very good points.
Thanks.
Awesome.
Do you have anything else?
No, I've gone through every single point I have.
Awesome. We like to end each podcast with a segment that I like to call Dialing In. We've talked about a lot of things. We're about to get back to work. We hope that you do too. And at the very least, we hope you think about what we talked about in this podcast. Generally, we like to wrap it up with one big quote that kind of embodies everything. Interestingly, today isn't quite a quote. It kind of is. It's my own, based on my experience trying to find a quote. Here it is. When I asked ChatGPT to give me a list of quotes about imposter syndrome, because I don't have any of my own, I recognized a pattern amongst those speaking on the issue. 7 were actors, 3 were writers, and 1 was a chef. What do these all have in common? The subjective success of their work. This serves as a reminder. If you can quantify the success of your work, then you do indeed deserve the title. Thanks for listening.